Prosecutors have charged 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse.
When I think back, it's...
2 people were shot during the riots this week.
There's a lot of things I wish I did.
One of the people who was there right at the scene was Richie McGinniss.
Given where I was in danger. It certainly changed my life.
How did it change your life?
The moment the shots went off, it was like...
The right felt that it was imperative for you to portray Kyle as a hero. When you did not do that,
they're going to call him a white supremacist, and we're going to call him a hero. My dad's professor and Bill Clinton's professor at Georgetown.
Richie went to Georgetown, by the way, and voted for Obama twice. So, yeah.
And you can go ahead and send me your hate mail. My DMs are open.
Daniel Penny happened. And you can draw the obvious parallels.
Sorry, I don't know.
You're good.
I'm dying over here.
That's just like the inner liberal coming out. Liberalism leaving the body while Trump takes over.
Yeah, exactly. My liberal demons.
The vibes are better now to be a Trump supporter.
It changed my views. It's not to say that I just swung completely to the right, but...
Would you say that night in Kenosha was the single most consequential day in your life?
I would say my dad dying was the most consequential day of my life, but Kenosha was number 2. The birth of my child is a positive consequential moment, so I would put that in a different category. But it certainly changed my life.
How did it change your life?
It totally changed my perspective on how news works and the people who get caught up in this vicious news cycle that we have in this day and age. And also from a personal perspective, it changed my understanding of what happens after death.
For the uninitiated, let's rewind a little bit. Mm-hmm. You don't have to go too much into what happened that night. Walk me through why you decided to talk about it in a way that you actively did. And to lay the groundwork for you a little bit, after all things Rittenhouse happened, you actively chose not to lean towards it was great that Rittenhouse was there, or hey, Rittenhouse is a horrible person who killed 2 people.
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, I knew immediately from the moment that the shooting happened, actually not until, I guess, about 10 minutes after the shooting. When I was in the hospital, I tried to save Joseph Rosenbaum after he was shot and carried him to the hospital. And after I loaded him onto the gurney, there was a police officer there, and I said, look, I have footage of this shooting that just took place. And I opened my phone, and to my horror, I realized that I took a photo of the ground. I was on the phone with my coworker Shelby, like something's about to go down, and said, oh, I heard screaming, so I hung up on her, switched to my camera app, and I took a photo of the ground instead of filming. So I had my hands up. I thought I filmed the shooting and realized that I didn't. And from that moment, I realized that I was going to have to testify to what I saw rather than just show my video. So my role as a witness really changed. I think it really upped the stakes of everything that I said publicly between then and the trial, knowing not only that everything I said publicly would be used potentially in the trial by the prosecution or defense, but also the fact that if I expressed any extreme opinions, like the anger or sadness that I had, I might be determined to be a biased witness. So my role was to say what I saw and to be perceived by the jury as somebody who was credible. And that role was, I think, something that really changed my understanding of my role in the news, because in this day and age, you know, if I had said one way or the other, I would have gotten a lot of love from this side or that, but instead I didn't really get any love. In fact, I got quite a bit of hate from both sides, but I had to serve that role. And you know, by the time I got to the trial and testified afterwards, that's when all these news companies wanted to interview me after the acquittal. And I waited like 1.5 years before I said anything, because I didn't want to add any fuel to the flames after the fact. And
we'll come back to you getting love or lack thereof.
We don't need to worry about that.
But while that was happening that night, and you realizing that, okay, there might be a time where I have to express what I saw and maybe even have some opinions, given the context of that summer when that was happening, vis-a-vis all things BLM, vis-a-vis all things riots, COVID, and all that stuff, it was as heated of an environment as I've ever seen. I'm 28 years old. I've been in journalism for 8 years at this point, in U.S. journalism for 8 years, journalism for 10 years. But point being, that was the most heated environment I've ever worked in. And I know you personally. I know that you have political opinions on either sides of the aisle. You could have gone any which way with how you portrayed what you saw.
Yeah.
And you're smart enough to know what could have been the consequences of those. Why did you actively chose to, take a step back and assess your situation? Because I don't want to name any names, but there were a lot of people in that same courtroom who were not like you, who took pretty severe stances on what they saw, and they made no apologies in terms of expressing said opinions. Why did you choose to kind of sort of step back and be like, this is what I saw and that's pretty much it?
Well, I think it goes all the way back to my family. Number one, supporting me and making sure I didn't fly off the handle when I felt emotional about what was going on. But also the fact that I'm in the middle of 3 boys. And so being a middle brother, from the moment that I can remember, I was either playing the role of older brother, the guy who knows everything, telling the younger brother what's up, showing him the ropes, or a younger brother, hey, cool older brother, please let me tag along and show me the ropes. And so that ingrained in me a way of understanding the world based upon my role. And so when you're a journalist, you have the role of what? Of sharing your opinions or showing people what's going on, or both. In the context of what happened in Kenosha, after that, I just viewed it as the former, just tell people what I saw, because my role then changed from journalist to witness. And I think my family really helped me through the whole process of, and also actually my best friend's dad, who is a criminal lawyer. And this is kind of the synchronicity of the whole thing. They got divorced. My best friend's parents got divorced when we were kids, and my dad was kind of his substitute dad when he wasn't around because of the divorce. And about, 18 years later, my dad passed away, and he served as my substitute dad, and he was in the courtroom with me. And so through the whole process, he was telling me, if you're going to do a public appearance, you got to be careful with what you say. And if you do cast aspersions or positive whatever, then people will view you, put you in the jury will view you as not somebody who's trying to tell what they saw, but somebody who's trying to either get Kyle put behind bars or somebody who's trying to keep him free. So the role of witness became really primary with respect to that event, and with respect to the other events that I was covering in between the shooting and the trial. Because if I really came across as this side or that side, then again, my testimony would be called into question because of that.
The reason I want to talk about that, because the scaffolding around you at that time was all things right of center. You worked at the Caller, which is a conservative outlet. You've been on Tucker since then, which is a right of center show. You took a time after that, and you decided to write a lengthy piece, for which you were heavily reprimanded from the people who thought that you were playing for their team.
Yeah.
Why did you write that piece, and what did that reaction feel like to you?
I wrote the piece because after this was, so I guess it wasn't over a year. It was actually 9 months after the trial. I wrote the piece on the anniversary because I did have all of these. I had a personal experience with what happened, and I wasn't able to share how it felt. And I thought that was something important to tell the public, because these people who get thrown into the media machine, like I was saying, they get treated as caricatures, not human beings, but Kyle Rittenhouse being the perfect example. Either he's a white supremacist or he's a hero. So that was the title of the piece, was Kyle Rittenhouse is not a hero. He's also not a white supremacist. Now, when I wrote the piece, people mostly paid attention to the first part and not the second part. But I just wanted to tell people.
How would you strongman either of those two arguments?
How would I strongman them?
How would you strongman the argument that Kyle is a hero and Kyle is a white supremacist? I want you to make the case for
well, I think what happened was after the shooting, there were two narratives that were spun up, but largely, at the time, media was definitely, I would say, predominantly anti-Trump.
Yeah.
As far as like corporate media, especially, who's really like driving the national narrative forward. And there was this narrative that came out of Kenosha immediately. I remember the morning after, and that's why I decided to go public and go on Tucker, because he had the biggest audience, but also because I read a Vice News article that morning, the morning after the shooting, and it said that Kyle opened fire on protesters. And that was just a complete mischaracterization of what happened, because I saw a man chase after Kyle, yell F you, and then dive for his weapon. And that is not opening fire on a protester. And in fact, that guy was lighting fire, so he wasn't a protester, he was a rioter, Joseph Rosenbaum. And that complete lack of care for the facts on the ground, even with, there was a video of the shooting from Drew Hernandez recorded it from maybe 50 feet away, and I was about 15 feet away. So you could even see based on that video that that's not what happened at all. Mm-hmm. But me being so close to it, I felt a responsibility to tell the public before, not wait a year until the trial to tell the public what I saw. And when I went on Tucker, that's when CNN took my statements, and because I was on Tucker, they perceived it as, I must be, like you said,
partisan
in that box.
Yeah.
And so the reporter said, McGinniss supported the conservative claim that Rittenhouse acted in self-defense. And again, my family, I was really angry when that happened, and I was jeopardizing my role as a witness. I didn't support any claim. I was stating my observations. I interviewed Kyle 13 minutes before the shooting. I told Tucker and his audience why Kyle told me he was there, and just in his own words, and that being characterized as a support of a conservative claim was simply not the case. So immediately after that, I wanted to fly off the handle, go on Twitter, and CNN is bad and yada yada yada. But my family, my best friend's dad, who's a lawyer, they said, and Jeff, who was our boss for a while, former Marine, tough guy, very tough guy.
And now he's a softie.
Yeah, now he's a softie on the inside. Yeah, but he told me in very plain terms, hey, calm down. We can go through the proper channels here. And I'm very glad that he said that and that he guided me through that process, because I went to Matt Dornick at CNN, who was running their PR at the time, and I worked my way to the reporter who did the original report, and I said, have me on to correct the record, or basically prepare for court. And they had me on to correct the record, and actually did a very good piece about what I witnessed and the details of what I saw. And I think that was kind of a metaphor for my entire experience covering the protests in 2020 and all the way through 2021, which is, you see all these big media companies and people have their opinions about this one or that one, but they're human beings working within those companies. And so in the same way that the human beings on the ground get dehumanized and turned into these characters, somebody from the Daily Caller might view people at CNN, oh, well, since they work there, they're this. But when you actually interface with the human beings, and instead of, reaching out a backhanded slap, I reached out a hand and said, hey, can we fix this? And it got fixed.
Let's go back to the article real quick. And what was the reaction from that piece, and how did the right kind of sort of realize that?
Well, I mean, I'm not one to like whine and complain. I knew that I was kicking the hornet's nest, but I felt that it was my responsibility to give my opinion once the trial was done, and just put on the record what my experience was like watching Joseph Rosenbaum die. I didn't know that he had done very bad things in his past, and I was trying to express to the audience what it was like having a man who I didn't know, watching him die in front of me, and in fact watching him with regret in his eyes. And I didn't know what that regret was until after the fact, when I found out all the terrible things that he did. But I think that experience and writing about it was perceived by the right as sympathy, and they didn't think that Rosenbaum deserved the sympathy because of what he did in his past and what he did to Kyle, chasing him down and lunging for his gun. But I think that with a tragedy like that, or any tragedy, if you're going to understand it, if I explain that Joseph Rosenbaum committed those crimes, sexual assault, and we don't have to get, I don't know what words I can and can't say. I mean, it's pretty grisly stuff that he did to minors. of the sexual nature.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not excusing what he did, but the deeper story is that his stepfather did the same thing to him, and the kids that he assaulted then did the same. Some of them are in jail for the same crimes. And so you can't really fully understand the tragedy and why it happened unless you get that bigger perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And in trying to express that deeper story to the audience, I think a lot of people were really angered by.
Why do you think? Why do you think? Okay, staying on that anger.
Yeah.
Why do you think it was the right felt that it was imperative for you to portray Kyle as a hero? Because you, as everything unfolded, people realized that you were as close to the epicenter as anybody else. So the right felt that it was your job to kind of sort of push the narrative of Kyle Rittenhouse is a hero. And when you did not do that, they were pissed about it. Why do you think they really wanted you to say that?
Well, I think, first off, I do think that the idea that Kyle was a hero also emerged from the fact that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris implied that he was a white supremacist, simply because there was evidence in social media that he supported Donald Trump. So at that time, if you supported Donald Trump, then you were a white supremacist. And so I think the right, who, if you're a conservative, you're supposed to stick to your principles no matter what. And that's your foundation. But I do think that in this current day and age, there's a tendency to be a reactionary, and go with that knee-jerk reaction. And so they said, if they're going to call him a white supremacist, then we're going to call him a hero. I also think, that city didn't deserve what happened to it. And there's a lot of anger about all of the damage that came out of the BLM protests and riots from the right. And it was just very enigmatic of the whole thing. And so Kyle was viewed as somebody who was trying to step up and restore order. And I think absolutely that's what he was trying to do. But a lot of times you can go into a situation with good intentions and bad things happen. So the fact that Joseph Rosenbaum tried to take his gun and he shot him, I think the left doesn't realize, especially like if you're actually in that situation, what would have happened if he had gotten a hold of his gun? So people say, oh, he shot somebody who was unarmed, but he could have immediately gone from unarmed to armed if he had have gotten a hold of the gun. And so I think the idea that he was a hero was really tied to very legitimate anger that arose from what was happening to our country at the time. And Kyle was there with a med kit and with an AR trying to restore order. And in fact, he told me 13 minutes before the shooting, he told me, I'm here with my med kit to try to help the protesters who got hit by riot munitions and stuff like that. I have my med kit and I'm going to go out there. And I followed him as he shouted, medical, does anyone need medical attention? Through the crowd that had been dispersed from the front of the courthouse. And I do think that he was very genuine in his efforts to protect that business, the Car Source lot, but also to provide medical attention. With that being said, as we were walking around and he's holding a rifle and shouting, medical, does anyone need medical attention? I could see that there were a lot of bad dudes out there, and I could see that they were not happy with, they didn't have the same ideas that he did about why he was there, and they were really angry. And when I think back, there's a lot of things I wish I did, but if it had been my younger brother out there, I would have dragged him out by his ear. But that wasn't my role at the time. My role was to be a fly on the wall and to show people what was going on and not say, hey, do you know what you're doing is bad? Whether it was a rioter or a guy with a rifle or a police officer, my role was to just be as invisible as possible and or gain the trust of the people on the ground to tell me what they really think. And so I was following him and I could see some anger. And then in fact, as we were walking, this group of guys said, oh, you think you're cool, man? We remember you. We remember you from earlier. You think you're cool? You think you're in a movie with that gun? And I went over to interview those guys. This is now like 5 minutes before the shooting because I wanted to get their perspective. So he had all these ideas of all these good reasons that he was out there, but they didn't agree with that. Mm-hmm. So my job was not only to show, this side out on the ground, but also the other side. So I went to ask those guys why they were mad at him. And actually, one of them had a handgun. Another guy had some bricks in his hands. They like stepped out on me because I aimed my phone at them. And I was like, okay, I'm sorry. I'll put my phone away. And I used my go-to move, as you know, in these, maybe not the best thing to do at a riot, but this my way of earning the trust was break out a White Claw.
Classic.
And so I said, does anyone want a White Claw?
Yeah.
And the dude with the handgun was like, yeah, actually, I'll take a White Claw. And I thought it broke the ice. And so, and I was like, I don't even need to film. I just want to hear why you guys are mad at him. And the moment that I cracked it and handed it over to that guy, I saw Kyle running down the street, now with the AR, the med kit, and a fire extinguisher, and he was running. And I knew that he was running towards something, that something was going on. And so I said, sorry guys, I gotta go. And I ran after Kyle, and I called Shelby up, our former coworker, who was a reporter who traveled around with me during all this protests and riots. And I said, something's about to go down. Where are you? And she was like, I'm on Sheridan Road. I was like, oh yeah, me too. And the moment that we found out that we were somewhere in the same vicinity, that's when I heard the screaming and hung up and took the photo of the ground. But that whole experience within that 14-minute period was me serving the role, what I perceived as my role in that situation, which is interview everybody. But the moment the shots went off, it was like that role disappeared because there was somebody who was dying in front of me.
The reason I wanted to dissect all of this is because you then had a few years to zoom out, actually parse what you went through, and write a book about it.
Mm-hmm.
During that same timeline, I live in New York, a couple of blocks away from where I live. All things Daniel Penny happened.
Yep.
And you can draw the obvious parallels.
Yes.
Between both of those stories.
Yeah, definitely.
And those parallels can be that of vigilantism.
Mm-hmm.
That can be why that chaos happened in the first place, and how some people were failed by the society writ large.
Yeah.
Those are the ones which come to my mind.
Yeah, definitely.
What kind of comparisons do you actually see in that same story? And obviously Daniel Penny is free now, and the guy who he was strangling, thinking that he was keeping everybody else safe, he also died.
Mm-hmm.
What are the obvious comparisons that pops to your head in the first place?
Well,
and how do you think those people are failed by the system and the system? And we'll then also talk about Daniel Penny.
Yeah. Well, the obvious comparison is that both of these cities were Democrat-run cities, and there was a situation that became lawless, and there were no police in the area. Or there were police in Kenosha, but they weren't doing anything to stop what was going on.
Yeah.
Other than people trying to assault the courthouse and the surrounding municipal buildings. They weren't doing anything to stop the burning of all these businesses.
And neither do the cops in the subways of New York.
There were no cops in the subways. And that situation, I think, it's really easy for people to sit at home and sit on their keyboards and say, I would have done this or that. But when chaos unfolds, a different part of your brain turns on, and it becomes very primal, and the thinking disappears, and it's all primal circuitry. And so it's not like, oh, what should I do next? It's just pure instinct. And in those kinds of situations, I think it's really easy to say, should have done this or should have done that. But it's really hard to keep your wits about you when bad things like that happen. And so I think the similarity between the two is not only, that there was this power vacuum and a dangerous situation that was created by what I would amount to political gamesmanship of, if this side is going to say that we need law and order, then we need to be as lenient as possible. But also the fact that once it happened, there was all kinds of speculation about he should have done this or that, but life is messy, and it doesn't always fit into those neat little boxes that people want after a tragedy like that happens.
You can correct me if you disagree, but I view you not as an ideologue, but more as a bohemian of the swamp. And you sway from either direction, not because you lack principles or fundamentals, but more often than not, situations are nuanced. Mm-hmm. And you actually want to figure out what's going on before taking any sides. Something which was pretty consequential to your life, my life, in terms of how I view the city was Jan 6. And you can obviously speak to it better than I can because you were in the ground inside the Capitol as things were happening. How do you think that day not only changed the city, but the fundamental basics of capital D, capital R politics?
Yeah, well, I like you said, I went from studying Arabic at Georgetown to Al Jazeera Arabic to MSNBC, NBC, to Mark Levin to Daily Caller. So over the course of that trajectory, I learned a lot of things. And when I started working for Mark Levin, I saw the other side of America. You know, I grew up in the New York area. I've been in DC for 16 years, and I didn't really quite understand how that side of America thought. And, you know, I this is towards the end of my dad's life when I was working for Mark Levin. We would joke. We would be talking, you know, I'd do the cold open for the show, and he'd watch the show, and he'd say afterwards, he'd say, this Levin guy's kind of got a point about this Constitution thing. And I think that it changed my views. And it's not to say that I just swung completely to the right, but I understood that there was a lot of merit to their view of the world and their view of what America is and what it should be. And so then to go to your second question about the way that January 6th changed this city, I think it really supercharged the rhetoric and the way in which our discourse functions, because it was such a spectacle that, you know, the left obviously used it as a cudgel to bash Trump supporters and to bash Trump, saying, look what this gets you. And then vice versa, the right was, who had been condemning all the violence that happened for the entire summer, was compelled to say, you know, this was just a walk in the park. And it was the same situation as I saw at the BLM stuff, which is you have a group of thousands of people, and within that group, there's a much smaller group. Those thousands of people go out to protest. They have good intentions. And within that smaller group, within that larger group, there's a smaller group that have more nefarious goals, and they want to aggravate the police, or they want to break down the doors of the House floor and actually stop the votes. There are other people who just follow the crowd into the Capitol, and they're from Arkansas, and they're just saying, oh man, look at this, you know, check this out. And again, I think that's similar to what happened in Kenosha, where once the pepper spray comes out, once the tear gas comes out, a different part of your brain turns on. Once you see one of your buddies get billy clubbed by a cop, you turn into, I think in the modern world, we forget the fact that we do have this primal side of our humanity, and we're lulled into this false sense of security that when those situations do happen, it's really amazing what can happen to a person, and how that anger and that just the burning of your eyes when you get pepper sprayed can just completely scramble your decision making. And so, you know, not only do I think that a lot of the people on January 6th or in Kenosha got caught up in a situation that they weren't expecting, but also, you know, when you do get caught up in that situation, it's really hard to think, you know, okay, well, what's the right thing to do now? It's just like, okay, I'm getting whacked by a billy club, you know, I curl into a ball or I push back. And having been in these situations, you know, my job was always just to, like, I'm a hockey player too, which I think served me pretty well as far as like bouncing off of the hits, because while the protesters / rioters would push back on the police, that I obviously couldn't do that. My job was to be in between the two, show people what was going on, and just roll with the punches. So I think that helped me, you know, knowing that was my role, always grounded me and kept me from, like, when I was at the Capitol, I was on the other side of the house doors. The sergeant at arms had their guns drawn on the other side of the doors. There's that famous photo of the guy sticking his face through the broken glass. I was right behind that guy. and I thought I was going to get caught in the crossfire again. Those guys were trying to break down the doors when there were 20 of them at the doors and 2 cops when I first arrived. Police finally brought reinforcements in and pulled them away from the doors. Minutes later, I'm in the rotunda and this guy rolled a joint. And that was my most viral clip of January 6th, was this guy smoking a joint underneath the rotunda. And I think that shows the breadth of what the same thing as BLM. You had guys who just, I mean, that's not to say that, rolling a joint.
We're not comparing anything.
Yeah, not to say that rolling a joint and smoking it in the Capitol is, I'm not condoning that, but that's not a violent act.
Yeah.
And, so that.
It's a victimless act.
And the scope of, there was a small group that was outside those doors trying to break them down.
Yeah.
While there were congressmen on the other side of the doors. But there were also people who were not in there for violent reasons.
Yeah.
And who were not actually, explicitly trying to beat up on cops or anything like that. They just followed the crowd in. And so I think, the nuance there, as well as at BLM, was completely lost once it got thrown into the narrative machine.
Speaking of narrative, the reason I think, because, you work in journalism, politics, so do I, and we are enamored by our day-to-day news stories and basically chasing the clicks, and all that comes with the job.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't get enough time to actually zoom out and think about the fact that when I was coming into journalism 10 years ago-ish, we came into all things, and I even hate using this term, liberal world order, which is Obama getting elected, Macron, Angela Merkel, Trudeau, and there was this default way of thinking, and some can say, and I would be one of those people, the world needed that.
Yeah.
Because as it turns out, the engine of capitalism is progress and making sure that things move forward. You can push back, by the way, if you disagree with it. And I thought that was something which the world needed. And the first time when Brexit was happening, I was in the UK, and the girl I was seeing, her dad was a fisherman in England. And that was the first time I realized I had my Mark Levin moment, and I realized through his lens what kind of effect he was dealing with because of trading with Belgium and the angst working class people in England were going through.
Yep.
And I was not hearing that side in my university or in my journalism circles in London. And I was like, there's this whole faction of the world which wants to push back. Then I moved to the US, then all things Trump happens, and I realized that, there's this brewing sense of unrest, and there's this other way of thinking. And all of that crescendos into COVID, BLM riots, all that we talked about to begin with. And with Trudeau stepping down a couple of days ago and Trump being inaugurated tomorrow, I think that whole era is coming to an end. What do you make of, what was it like? What was the world like for the last better half of the decade and what it might become starting tomorrow?
Well, that's why I wrote the book, because there's a much deeper story to why Trump got elected in 2016 in the first place. Like you mentioned, the farmers or the fishermen who feel like this global world order hasn't served them very well, and that the leaders of their own countries should be looking after the citizens rather than this harmonious global community. Yeah. And in the book, I detail going.
I love that, by the way, harmonious global community.
Yeah. Well, it sounds nice, right? But I talk about that a lot in the chapter where we went to Seattle to the Chaz. Yeah. Because that's the home base for all these major multinational corporations like Microsoft, Boeing, Starbucks, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Yeah. And Amazon. And so there was this moment in Seattle when we were marching. The East Precinct was Carmen Vest, who was the police commissioner at the time. She capitulated the East Precinct to the protests because in the spirit of, quote, de-escalation. Because at the time, there was this anti-police fervor throughout the country, and she basically bowed down to that and said, okay, well, we'll abandon the East Police Precinct and you guys can have your little fiefdom.
Yeah.
By the way, what's the first thing they did? They put up barriers, not walls,
Yeah.
but barriers and armed guards at the checkpoints. Not a wall, because that would be too close to what Trump was doing with our southern border. But we marched from the East Precinct to the West Precinct, which was still occupied by police, and that's in the commercial district. And they were protesting against the police. It's this little 2-story building, and the police were sitting there in the second floor looking out the plate glass windows down at the protesters, and they were giving the middle finger to the cops. And in that moment, we were literally in the shadow of the 3-tower complex of Amazon. And during COVID, while all these small businesses were shut down, which I think was a whole nother cause for the anger that was just bubbling up in the country, in addition to COVID and all the politics and all that. But Amazon almost doubled its revenue. And Jeff Bezos, by 2021, became the richest man in the world. And so everybody is protesting these blue-collar cops who are trying to feed their families in the police precinct, when right behind them is this leviathan of multinational, globalist corporate power.
Let me put my liberal hat on real quick and to make the point that during that time, the reason that happened was because people were ordering shit ton of stuff because they had nothing else to do. So why, to the normie voter, why should they be bothered by the fact that Amazon, the company which they use every fucking day of their lives, the owner of the company is the richest guy in the world?
Well, that's why in the book I get into a lot of history as well, because Seattle was ground zero for the WTO protests in 1999. At the end of 1999, Bill Clinton was finishing out his second term, and as a Democrat, and I think this largely contributed to why Trump was able to win in 2016, he perpetuated a lot of the free trade policies that Bush 1 initiated during his I didn't silence my phone. That Bush 1 initiated during his term in the early 90s. And so NAFTA was a Bush initiative that Clinton then oversaw and actually expanded into the World Trade Organization. And there was this idea that I think what people would refer to as the uniparty, that if we can make things good for corporations, then that will uplift the entire population,
That was
not
the
only of
premise.
the country, but of the whole world. And I'm not saying that, there weren't good intentions behind that notion.
Yeah.
But when the toothpaste came out of the tube 15 years later, you had a backlash against that, because during that time period, there were millions of American jobs that were shipped overseas. And so these people who were able to put food on the table for their families with a good paying manufacturing job lost those jobs to places like China. And I mean, Amazon, where do most of those products manufactured? China.
Yeah.
And so I'm not so much in that instance, I'm not so much saying, well, people should be mad at Jeff Bezos instead of the cops. What I'm saying is that the bigger picture is that the police are just the enforcers of a much bigger system.
Yeah, the foot soldiers.
And and so to direct all of your anger towards those human beings is not addressing the bigger issue of, well, why is it that we have such a massive disparity between the rich and the poor in the United States and in the world, and what policies led to that? And so, I think that Obama, and I moved to DC in 2008. I knocked on doors for Obama in Virginia, and I was this idealistic kid thinking that,
just so I can have your liberal credentials out there in the open, can you let people know who you voted for and who you voted for in the last 4 years?
Yeah.
I need a cold open.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, this is probably where I'm going to lose everything. This is where everyone's going to tune out right here. So Obama, the first time, largely because I was studying Arabic, and he promised to pull the troops out of Iraq.
Okay.
In a Washington Post op-ed while he was running in the summer of 2008.
Yeah.
Promised to pull all the troops out of Iraq by 2010. I thought that in studying Arabic, I was going to help lead the way of this whole new American foreign policy in the region.
Yeah.
And well,
You had a Paul Atreides complex.
Yeah. Long story short, the troops did not get pulled out of Iraq. And secondarily, I did vote for Obama the second time.
Yeah.
Which I might have some regret about that, but I really did want to see if, his hope and change message that he had initially in 2008.
Yeah.
I wanted to see if, a second term would allow him to actually really enact those policies.
Okay.
That would really change things. I would argue that didn't
happen.
So in 2016, I didn't vote.
Okay.
And in 2020, I voted for Kanye West.
Okay.
And in 2024, I voted for Cornel West.
Okay.
And I think, people could call that a cop-out,
Yeah.
and that's legitimate, and
Yeah.
I understand that. But also, I think as my role in media, as I started to take it more seriously, I also, I don't want to be going into every situation, every news event with, I'm in this camp. So if I cast my vote for one of those two-party candidates,
Yeah.
then I think that will put me in one of those two camps, and it will change my ability to separate my emotions from my reasoning.
Yeah.
And
I know you're, well, having lived with you, I know you have some beliefs which lean pretty much to the right of the bigger things in the world. Why do you think it was so easy for you to vote for Obama twice, and you, even though you agree with Trump on a myriad of issues, you couldn't get yourself to press that button?
Well, I think number one, I'm 35. You're what, 28 now?
Yeah.
I am more concerned with what world we are going to inherit after Trump.
Yeah.
And I do view, after Jimmy Carter died, the two oldest presidents that were still living were the Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Yeah. And, the boomer generation, my parents are boomers, they have really been clinging to power, not only in the political realm, but in finance, in business, all across the spectrum. And I think that they've really been laying the tracks for which way the train goes in America.
Yeah.
And I might agree with a lot of things that, a lot of policies that Trump promised both in 2016 and in 2020 and in 2024. But I also don't agree with the way in which our media landscape functions right now. And I think that's largely due to Trump's tendency to name call and stuff like that. And I'm not clutching my pearls here. I'm not like, oh, he's such a terrible guy. How could he possibly do that? Because I do think
you're allowed to do that, by the way.
And I do think, I do think imperfect men are often, precisely because of their flaws, the ones who are able to change history. Yeah. Winston Churchill was like not exactly the nicest, most fun guy to be around.
Yeah.
But
I've heard.
Yeah. But and we don't need to get into that's a whole other can of worms. But history often chooses imperfect people to change the trajectory. And I can support a lot of those things, but I just, given how politically charged everything is now, I'm trying my best to see the bigger picture.
I will give you a comp if that makes you feel better.
I'm a cop out. It's a cop out.
It's not about being a cop out, but I will give you a comparison. So, like, you brought up Churchill. We all know what Churchill did, and maybe one of the bigger reasons why Hitler did not come to power. Yeah. And most people forget, and it's probably a footnotes in the history books, is the fact that while the war was happening, Churchill redirected a lot of grains and food away from the place where I was born in India.
Yes, that's true.
To feed his troops in England. And there was a massive famine. It's called the Bengal famine, where my parents are from. And millions of people died because there was no food. Am I mad that happened? Yes. Am I stoked that Nazis did not come to power? Yes. Point being, he was as imperfect of a man as they came. And he was also one of the most leading forces why Hitler lost. Yeah. And arguably one of the big, like the better leaders, I'm not saying moral leaders,
Yeah.
leaders in the political history to have ever been around. So will I tell my kids about Churchill and what he did to the place where I was born? 100%. Will I also tell him that that's what a good leader does in terms of making sure that the goal is completed and the objective is done and the mission is completed? Yes, it is, because as it turns out, most leaders are in service to their mission.
Yeah.
And bringing it full circle to all things Trump, what do you think his mission is come this year?
Yeah. Well, I actually just wrote an article begging the question of whether or not Trump, and this actually ties in perfectly with Churchill, whether or not he could buck what I call the Anglo-American establishment. What actually my dad's professor and Bill Clinton's professor, Carol Quigley at Georgetown, who Clinton invoked in his
Richie went to Georgetown, by the way, and voted for Obama twice. So,
tune out now and unfollow, and you can go ahead and send me your hate mail. My DMs are open. But everybody says, like, everybody's arguing now, like, oh, Israel controls the world and they run America.
Yeah.
But really, from my perspective and from Carol Quigley's perspective, he makes the argument that we inherited the Anglosphere. And
can you define that?
So at the time that America rose to become the world's leading superpower in the capitalist camp after World War II, the sun was finally setting on the British Empire. With that being said, all of the lines that were drawn in the nation states in places like the Middle East, those were drawn by the Brits and the French with the express intention not of creating a nation state that could stand on its own, but of dividing and conquering them and taking all these sectarian groups and dividing them up so that they could rule them.
Yeah, India, Pakistan.
Yes, exactly. and so now the United States has inherited that world order.
Interesting.
And we have been charged as the world police to enforce those borders.
Yeah.
And everything that's happened, I think the Middle East is the perfect example. Everything that happened in Iraq, that country was led by Saddam Hussein, who is Sunni, which is the 30% minority, and that country is 60% Shia and 10% Kurdish, is approximately. And those borders were drawn because that's how the Brits did things. They would draw the borders, and then they would take a minority population, and they'd say, hey, we're going to give you the power, we're going to give you the mandate, and we'll rule through you. Because if you try to give the majority the power, they're going to say, what are you talking about? We're the majority in this country. We want to run the show.
Yeah.
So that entire approach has had all of these downstream ramifications after World War II that really have resulted in untold deaths and violence. And my perspective, and one place where I totally agree with Trump, and I agreed with Obama, at least what he was promising, but not what he actually brought forth, that it's not the United States' job to perpetuate the sins of the colonial past. And it's our leaders' jobs to look after American citizens and not to look after the entire world. And I think as the belt gets tightened and financial times get difficult, and as things become harder and harder for average Americans to make ends meet, that's when people really start to take a second look at the way that things are done. And so I think, like you were saying earlier, the swinging of the pendulum is something and that's why I talk a lot about history in the book, is because we've been here before. There have been previous populist movements in the United States. William Jennings Bryan in 1896 really initiated the transformation of the Democratic Party from the party of the South to the party of the working class. And look at how the South just voted in the last election. It's no longer the party of the South. Excuse me. So
it's no longer the party of the working class.
Well, exactly. So we're in the midst of another paradigm shift where Trump was able to capture that working class vote precisely because the Democrat Party assumed that they were going to get that vote for the last 60 years. And Trump said, well, what have they done for you in the last 60 years? And over the course of the last 8 years, you've seen him gain more and more, not only the working class vote, but of the sorry, I don't know.
You're good.
I'm dying
That's
over
just
here.
like the inner liberal
Yeah.
coming out.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
I'm
so-
exercising
yeah,
my My
it's,
liberal
it's
demons.
like liberalism leaving the body while Trump takes over tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Because like a
Just gotta
different
get it
part
out
of your
there.
brain like has to switch on tomorrow. So
But Jackson was another populist
yeah.
who wanted to kill the central bank
Uh-huh.
because he didn't think that it was going to help the average American. And all of these paradigm shifts that have taken place, the swinging of the pendulum, have happened as a result of the party that dominated, like the Republican Party that dominated American politics after the Civil War.
Yeah.
They dominated for the 30 years after the Civil War, and William Jennings Bryan said the same thing that Trump did, which is like, you guys are farmers and look at the gap between the rich and the poor. The Gilded Age was called the Gilded Age. It was named that by Mark Twain because something that's gilded is painted with gold, but it's not actually gold.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the Gilded Age was, up until this point, the biggest separation between the rich and the poor. And Jennings Bryan saw that and gave this famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896 at the Democratic Convention, saying that the gold standard was crucifying the American worker on a cross of gold, and he wanted to switch to the silver standard. And it took 20, 30 years before FDR really solidified that into the Democrat Party standing up for the working class and having that kind of messaging. And so I think, with the Trump era, getting back into, my votes, I think that there's a lot of change that's happening right now, and that I'm focused on who's going to inherit the country after the Trump era is complete. And I think if I just throw my hat in to all things Trump or all things never Trump, then it's going to be really difficult to climb out of that trench and view things with an open mind of where can we go from here. And I think, there's going to be a lot of soul searching in the Democratic Party of why did this happen? At least this is my hope. And I think it not only will change the Republican Party from, the party of the South and the party of quote unquote country club Republicans to the party of the working class, but also the Democrat Party is going to have to change their platform, and American politics will never be the same.
I think it's a bigger question of coalition building right now, especially for Republicans, which I'm fascinated by because, I view my politics as, which is not cosmetically anything to do with conservatism. Like, I spend 0 seconds of my life thinking about pro-life, pro-choice, transgenderism, while at the same time, as an immigrant, I have pretty strong stance of all things border, trade, taxation, while at the same time, I live in New York. I kind of identify as a default guy who lives in the city. Trump did a really good job capturing that vote and capturing all my friends' votes who work in tech and work in media, who would otherwise be nowhere close to touching a MAGA hat. And all of them are pretty proud Trump supporters today. Most of it is like the vibes are better now to be a Trump supporter because, as it turns out, Mark Andreessen, bigger VCs are committing. Like, if you see like smart, rich people committing towards Trump and not just your average redneck from Alabama, you feel more stoked to be like, oh, that actually can be my camp. So the point being, Trump got that vote, while at the same time, there is the, let's call it the Steve Bannon vote. So right now, the MAGA has to balance out, is this a happy marriage or was this just a means to an end? How do you think this battle will play out? And I'll give you my read is the tech bro party of MAGA would win because, as it turns out, that's where the money is. And what's the mean average voter of Trump? That's the Bannon vote. That's the vote which is pissed about all things jobs going away, all things illegal immigration, all things, everything Trump ran on circa 2016.
Shipping jobs overseas.
And the other side of the coin is the overlap between those two factions is being anti-woke, being pro-free speech, and saying, fuck the left.
And anti-war.
And anti-war.
Because I was anti-war and pro-free speech in 2008, and that was a left-wing position. And now that makes me like hard right.
And that's the only overlap between those two very diverse view of what MAGA should be and what role of America is. What's your read on all things future of MAGA?
Well, I think I'll go back to what you just said, which is, living in the city and being an immigrant, you had these perspectives because they're close, and the trans issue is not important to you because it's not close to home.
Yeah.
And so people vote based upon their own personal experience. And I had one view of the border, and then I went down there and I saw the building of the wall. And then when Joe Biden came into office, I saw them halt that construction, and I flew a drone up and saw thousands of migrants coming in through the gaps in the wall. And I asked every single one who was coming across the border, hey, why are you coming right now? And almost every single one said, we're coming because Trump's gone and Biden's here now, and we know that he's going to accept us with open arms. So I think once you actually personally experience it.
You know what the irony is there? Sorry to interrupt. The irony there is that most of those people would otherwise might as well be Trump voters. Okay, the better way to say it is that a lot of those people are conservatives.
Yeah, conservatives. Yeah, exactly. I've traveled to every country in Central America.
Yeah.
And I've talked with the people there and also talked with the migrants coming across the border. And I've always said that, which is that culturally it's extremely Catholic, extremely conservative.
Yeah.
And, Trump is this, we can go back and forth all day about whether Trump actually, is a quote unquote conservative.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is those people so much anger is put towards, they're coming over here illegally, they're violating the law, which is true according to what the law says, but also the Biden administration signaled to them basically that it was carte blanche and come on in and we'll give you a free flight.
They're my neighbors, by the way. They live in Roosevelt Hotel. Yeah.
And so exactly. So then that gets me right to the point of being a city dweller is what I saw at the border in March of 2021. I was like sounding the alarm, like this is crazy. Like this little city, McAllen, the hospitals are overwhelmed and they have to deal with thousands of migrants coming into their city every single day. And it's crazy down here. And like, this is wild. Like, how is this sustainable? And it wasn't until they started showing up in New York and I think one of the best articles of the last 4 years that encapsulated everything that you're talking about was these Williamsburg Brooklynites complaining that their dog park was now a migrant shelter. Yeah. And it just goes to show that, people can virtue signal all they want about immigration and, we need to be kind to the whole world. But the moment that they show up on their doorstep, they have a completely different perspective. So
as they say, like all politics is local politics.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing is that we've lost our local newspapers.
Yeah.
We've lost our local communities. We've lost this idea of a neighborly small town.
Yeah.
And everybody's in a big city. And, I lived in an apartment building for a year in DC, and like people who lived next to me for a year wouldn't even say hi in the elevator. And so as all that goes out the window, the national political tribe becomes your family. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are so charged for or against Donald Trump. But to go all the way back to your original question of how it's going to play out, I think like we talked over the weekend about the H-1B visa thing. And the left was saying, look at them fighting, like, this coalition's never going to last. But actually, I took the complete opposite take from that, which is look at how much the public discourse is wrestling with this question right now and going back and forth, and look at the way in which people are learning about it and coming to a conclusion by wrestling with it in a public forum. And I think that all of that happened out in the open with like Elon Musk tweeting this, and then all these MAGA, Steve Bannon disagreeing with him. I think all of that is actually, while it might be unsavory as far as like, maybe some not so polite things are said, the mere fact that that conversation about immigration is being had out in the open.
Yeah.
Neither party has wanted to touch the immigration issue for 40 years.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're even having that conversation, I think, is a really positive turn in the right direction to where, I'm not going to claim to have the end all be all answer to that, but the mere fact that that conversation is being had, I think, identifies a change in the way that our discourse is functioning right now, and specifically that the difficult questions that have gone unchecked for such a long time are now being
answered.
Yeah, and and even if they're not answered, they're at least being conversed about and brought into the public sphere. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you know me, like I lean right and I lean left, and
Yeah,
I'm like I'm super conflicted about a lot of bigger political questions, and as much as I'm bummed about all things political polarization, I'm pretty stoked about the fact that this year kind of sort of opened the gates of all things communication and being okay with, you know, I find it cliche to talk about cancel culture, but it was actually a thing.
Oh yeah,
like
I got canceled by plenty of friends for working at the Daily Caller.
Yeah, having lived in the corporate world, having worked with people who do all things coastal elites do.
Yeah.
That culture is changing right now, and that gives me good hope, while at the same time fully realizing that our politics is as divided as it was ever.
Yeah.
And last question I would ask you is, you're a dad now.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of, it's a corny question to ask, like, what kind of world are you leaving behind for your daughter? So I'm not going to ask you that. But you think deeply about America, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about all the things that you witnessed during your political career, during your journalism career. You have seen the city change in a way I did not, because you have been in DC longer than I have, and you were here where politics was civil and politics was cordial, while also existing post Jan 6, where the city became a green zone. Do you still want to raise your daughter in the city, and what kind of politics do you hope she gets from you?
I definitely do not want to raise my daughter in DC.
Oh no,
definitely not. I want to move to the beach eventually. I mean, she's young enough now that, like, you know, she could be in a slum in Queens, and, you know, she wouldn't even know the difference.
Yeah,
but like looking,
I think she would know the difference.
Maybe a little bit, maybe a little bit. I mean, she's a year, so I mean, she's paying more attention to what mommy and daddy are doing than what kind of house she's in or how plush the furniture is. But as far as what I want to imbue on her politically, I think the answer is nothing. I want to raise a child, and this is largely from my own parents, a child who has an open mind and this, I coached if you didn't know, it was Georgetown. I coached the Georgetown hockey team, and the kids I've seen definitely, like in 2020, comparing the way that kids talked about politics and talked about what was going on in the country. Yeah. Everyone was really scared to say what they really thought. Terrified. And it was really sad for me to see the school that I went to, where we'd be in the locker room just arguing about whatever it was. And that was how we learned. Like, when you're in college, you have to
jab and weave.
Also like experiment with ideas. And the only way that you can really like flesh out what you really believe is by having those kinds of conversations, and sometimes saying the wrong thing. And so if you're afraid of saying the wrong thing, then you're never really going to have that conversation. But fast forward to 24, half the team was for Kamala and half the team was for Trump. Yeah. And we would have it out in the locker room. And there's a much, I think, more open perspective of like, okay, you think that's cool. I think this. And like, I'm not going to cancel you just because you think that. Yeah. And I do think that that's largely due to the fact that, I mean, Trump just won the popular vote. Yeah. So that signals to me that Trump went from being really a countercultural movement to now mainstream. And in a lot of ways, that's a very good thing, because like I said, people are now more comfortable with having an open conversation, especially young people. But on the other hand, the worry that I have and what I, want for the future to change is the way in which now everybody's so deeply entrenched in their own viewpoint that it's unshakable. Yeah. And I do think that especially young people should be able to change their perspectives, and they shouldn't be like set in stone. And okay, if you think this when you're 20, you need to think it when you're 40. Yeah. And people have a tendency to lean more conservative once they start paying taxes for a couple of decades. But also, it's America, and we should have the ability to change our minds. And it shouldn't be like, well, since you said that, you're not allowed to change your viewpoint.
I'll end on a positive note. Not that wasn't a positive note. Is all things leading up to this year's election, liberalism was the culture, and all things MAGA was the counterculture.
Yeah.
Something which pissed me off because of that was, since progressives assumed that we are at the helm of the culture, their art became shitty. As someone who identifies as a quasi-creative, I was always upset with the fact that everything that we make is a sequel now. Art is shitty. Liberals no longer make good art.
Yeah.
And right now, given the fact, and as you said, all things MAGA and Trumpism is kind of sort of norm and part of the culture now, vis-a-vis the fact that he won the popular vote, I think liberals can go back to where they work their best, which is being part of the counterculture and be responsible for good art. And I'm stoked about it. Yeah. And I kind of want to be part of it, even though I know that I have fundamental conservative beliefs in my core.
Yeah.
So art should actually come back, and liberals should go back to taking care of it. Otherwise, we will get corny MAGA rappers, and I will kill myself if I listen to another one of those songs.
Yeah, and look
the fact that Vivek Ramaswamy had to rap during Iowa State Fair made me want to kill myself, and that happened because conservatives thought that they had to become counterculture.
Is this your positive note that you're ending? No, I will say, like, Hollywood is the best example of that, where Hollywood went from appealing to an American audience and having this litmus test at the box office where it's like, okay, did this movie do well? Yeah. And you immediately know, okay, how did it perform in the box office? And that would adjust the way that Hollywood told stories. Once the box office went from an American audience to a global audience, you don't want to get your movie banned in China, so we can't have any Chinese villains, or, we can't, say anything that will upset Xi Jinping because it's going to get banned in China. We're going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. I think we've seen a major backlash against that, where people are like, this movie stinks. And it took a really long time for Hollywood to react to that because of the fact that everything's behind a paywall now. So you don't have that same litmus test at the box office. But now that Trump won the popular vote, I think all of our institutions that contribute to the way that people view the world, whether it's politics or media or Hollywood or art, there's a re-examination of that. And what I've always said about where the modern left went is, like, if your entire foundation of your ideology is that all of the grand narratives of the past are bunk and we need to throw them all out and we need to critique them ad nauseum. Well, if your foundation is a critique, then that's nothing to stand on. And so now I think people are looking in the mirror and asking themselves, what do I really believe other than just Orange Man bad, right? So I think we're going to have an exciting 4 years, not just in terms of, like, it's exciting might not be the right adjective in terms of politics, but as far as American culture, I think there's a lot of very cool new ideas that are coming to the forefront now because of the fact that people aren't afraid to say what they think.
Perfect. Thanks, Rich.
There we go. Thanks for having me.